My name is Eleanor Grace Mitchell, and until 6 weeks ago, I thought I was dying. The doctors had given me 3 months to live after discovering what they believed was stage 4 pancreatic cancer. Funny how quickly your whole world can shift. With a few words from a man in a white coat who barely looked up from his clipboard when he delivered my death sentence. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I'm 62 years old, a retired high school English teacher who spent 37 years shaping young minds in the small town of Riverside, Ohio. My hands, once steady enough to grade papers until midnight, now shake slightly from the medications I thought were keeping me alive. My silver hair, which I've worn in the same neat bun for decades, has thinned considerably over the past months. But my mind, despite what my family apparently believes, remains as sharp as the day I corrected my first student's essay. I lived alone in the 2-story Victorian house on Maple Street that my late husband Robert and I bought 40 years ago when we were newlyweds fresh out of college. Robert passed away 8 years ago from a heart attack, leaving me with this house, a modest pension, and 3 adult children who I thought loved me. The house sits on nearly an acre of land, with rose gardens that Robert planted, and I've maintained religiously ever since. Every room holds memories of birthday parties, Christmas mornings, and family dinners where laughter echoed off the hardwood floors. After Robert's death, I discovered that grief has a way of reshaping not just your heart, but your entire understanding of family dynamics. My 3 children, Marcus, who's 38 and works as a regional sales manager for a pharmaceutical company, Diana, 35 and a part-time real estate agent when she's not busy with her yoga instructor certification programs, and Timothy, my youngest at 32, who changes careers more often than he changes his address, all seemed to rally around me initially. They called more frequently, visited on weekends, and made sure I wasn't drowning in the practical matters that Robert had always handled. But as the years passed, those caring phone calls evolved into something different. Marcus would call every Tuesday evening, not to check on my well-being, but to discuss his mortgage payment that was behind, or his wife Sandra's credit card debt that kept mounting. Diana would drop by on Sundays with her twin daughters, not for family time, but to casually mention that her latest business venture needed just a small loan to get off the ground, or that her ex-husband Jake was late on child support again. Timothy, sweet Timothy, would text me photos of his latest apartment or his newest girlfriend, followed immediately by messages about unexpected medical bills or car repairs that he simply couldn't afford on his current salary from whatever job he was working that month. I enabled them. I know that now. After Robert died, I felt so desperate to maintain connections with my children that I opened my checkbook every time they asked. When Marcus faced foreclosure 2 years ago, I paid $35,000 to save his house. When Diana's yoga studio failed last year, I covered the $15,000 in equipment loans she'd defaulted on. When Timothy needed bail money after a DUI last spring, I didn't hesitate to wire him $3,000. Over 8 years, I calculated that I'd given them nearly $200,000, most of it from Robert's life insurance policy and my retirement savings. The cancer diagnosis came on a rainy Thursday in October. I'd been experiencing stomach pains and unexpected weight loss for several weeks, symptoms I'd initially attributed to grief and aging. Dr. Harrison, my physician for the past 15 years, ordered a series of tests that led to more tests, until finally he called me into his office with that grave expression doctors wear when they're about to destroy someone's world. The tumor was aggressive, he explained, already spread beyond surgical intervention. Chemotherapy might buy me a few more months, but the quality of life would be severely compromised. He recommended getting my affairs in order and making arrangements for end-of-life care. I sat in his sterile office listening to him discuss hospice care and pain management, feeling strangely detached from my own mortality. That evening, I called each of my children to share the news. Their reactions varied, but each conversation followed a similar pattern of initial shock, expressions of love and support, and then almost immediately, practical questions about my arrangements and what I needed them to do. Marcus offered to help coordinate my medical care. Diana suggested she move back into the house to take care of me. Timothy, true to his nature, simply cried and promised to visit more often. Over the following weeks, my children transformed into a well-oiled support system. Marcus arrived every weekend from Columbus with Sandra and their teenage son Kevin, bringing groceries and handling household repairs. Diana practically moved into the guest room, claiming she wanted to spend every possible moment with me while managing my medications and doctor appointments. Timothy quit his latest job as a restaurant manager to become my full-time caregiver, sleeping on the couch and driving me to treatments. I was touched by their devotion, even as I noticed subtle changes in their behavior. They spoke to each other in hushed tones that stopped when I entered rooms. They had frequent private phone conversations that moved to the porch or the backyard. When I approached, Diana had taken over managing my mail and my finances, claiming she wanted to spare me the stress of bills and paperwork during my treatment. The chemotherapy was brutal. Every session left me nauseated and exhausted for days afterward. My appetite disappeared, and I lost nearly 30 pounds over 6 weeks. My children hovered around me constantly, bringing me soup I couldn't eat, and magazines I was too tired to read. They were so attentive that I began to feel guilty about the burden I was placing on their lives. It was during my 7th week of treatment that I began to notice the small inconsistencies. Diana would intercept phone calls before I could answer, them claiming they were probably telemarketers. Marcus spent hours in Robert's old study with the door closed, supposedly organizing my important papers. Timothy had developed a habit of checking the mailbox before I could get to it, bringing me only what he deemed necessary for me to see. My suspicions crystallized during a particularly difficult evening in November. I'd been feeling worse than usual after my latest chemotherapy session and had gone to bed early. Around midnight, I woke up feeling desperately thirsty and made my way downstairs to the kitchen. As I passed the living room, I heard voices coming from Robert's study. The door was slightly ajar, and light spilled into the hallway. I moved. Closer, my bare feet silent on the hardwood floor. Through the crack in the door, I could see all 3 of my children seated around Robert's old desk. Marcus had several manila folders spread out in front of him. Diana was typing on her laptop, and Timothy was taking notes on a yellow legal pad. The funeral home said they could handle everything for about $12,000, Diana was saying, her voice matter-of-fact and businesslike. That includes the casket, the service, and the burial plot next to Dad. My blood turned to ice water in my veins. I pressed myself against the wall, straining to hear more. That seems reasonable, Marcus replied, consulting what looked like a spreadsheet. The life insurance policy will cover that easily, plus the outstanding medical bills. According to Diana's calculations, there should be about $45,000 left after expenses. Don't forget the house, Timothy added. The real estate agent said it could sell for at least $350,000 in this market, maybe more if we fix up the kitchen first. Diana nodded, still typing. I've already gotten preliminary quotes from contractors. A kitchen? Renovation would cost about $20,000, but it could increase the sale price by $50,000. It's a smart investment. What about her retirement accounts? Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Marcus asked, shuffling through more papers. The financial advisor said there's about $180,000 between her pension and her 401k. Already taken care of, Diana said with a smile I could hear in her voice. I had her sign the beneficiary forms last week when she was especially sick. She was so out of it from the pain medication, she barely read them. The room started spinning around me. I gripped the doorframe to keep from falling as the full scope of their betrayal crashed over me like a physical blow. They weren't just planning my funeral. They were meticulously cataloging and dividing my assets while I was still breathing. The total comes to about $525,000, Marcus continued, his voice taking on the professional tone he used with his clients. Split 3 ways, that's roughly $175,000 each. Enough to solve all our current financial problems. More than enough, Timothy agreed with obvious relief. I can finally pay off my student loans and maybe put a down payment on a decent apartment. And I can start fresh with the real estate business, Diana added. Maybe even buy into that wellness center franchise I've been researching. Sandra and I can finally renovate our house and catch up on Kevin's college fund, Marcus said. Mom always said she wanted to help us build better lives for ourselves. The irony of that statement hit me like a physical slap. I had helped them build better lives for themselves repeatedly for 8 years. I'd sacrificed my own financial security and depleted Robert's legacy to bail them out of one crisis after another. And now they were sitting in his study, planning how to profit from my death while I lay upstairs believing they were caring for me out of love. How much longer do you think we have to keep this up? Timothy asked, and I could hear the weariness in his voice. The constant caregiving is exhausting, and honestly, it's hard to watch her suffer. Dr. Harrison said maybe another month, possibly 2 if she's lucky, Diana replied. The important thing is that we maintain appearances until the end. We can't have anyone questioning our devotion or our right to inherit. The neighbors have been very impressed with how well we're taking care of her, Marcus noted with satisfaction. Mrs. Patterson mentioned just yesterday how wonderful it was to see children stepping up for their parent in her time of need. They spoke about my impending death as if it were a business transaction they were waiting to close. There was no grief in their voices, no sadness about losing their mother. Only calculations and practical considerations about managing their inheritance. I stood frozen in that hallway for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, listening to them discuss the details of my funeral arrangements. They'd already chosen the flowers, written the obituary, and planned the reception. Diana had even selected the dress they wanted me buried in, a navy blue suit I'd worn to Robert's funeral that she said would photograph well for the memorial service. The most chilling detail was their discussion of my medical care. They'd been meeting with Dr. Harrison without my knowledge, discussing my treatment options and prognosis. More disturbing, they'd apparently been influencing my care decisions, encouraging the doctor to focus on comfort rather than aggressive treatment. They wanted me comfortable, but they also wanted me to die on schedule. When I heard chairs scraping against the floor, indicating they were preparing to end their meeting, I retreated upstairs as quietly as possible. I climbed back into bed and lay there in the darkness, my mind racing as I processed everything I'd overheard. My children, the people I'd loved unconditionally and supported financially for decades, were essentially waiting for me to die so they could claim their inheritance. The betrayal cut deeper than the cancer ever could. Physical pain was manageable, with medication, but the ache of discovering that my children saw me only as an obstacle between them and my money was a wound that no treatment could heal. I'd raised them to be better than this. I'd taught them about integrity, compassion, and family loyalty. Yet somewhere along the way, they'd learned to see relationships as transactions and love as a commodity to be leveraged for financial gain. The next morning, I observed my children with new eyes. Diana brought me tea and toast, her smile warm and caring as she fussed over my blankets and asked about my pain levels. Marcus called to check on me before work, his voice full of concern as he asked about my appetite and whether I needed anything from the pharmacy. Timothy sat beside my bed reading to me from a novel I'd enjoyed, his presence seemingly devoted and selfless. But now I could see the performance underlying their care. Diana checked her watch frequently, as if counting down the time until she could escape back to her real life. Marcus's phone calls were brief and efficient, hitting all the necessary topics without genuine emotional investment. Timothy's reading was mechanical, his attention clearly elsewhere as he turned pages and spoke words that held no meaning for him. I began to test them in small ways. I mentioned feeling better than I had in weeks, suggesting that maybe the treatment was working after all. The disappointment that flashed across their faces was quickly masked, but I caught it. When I talked about planning a trip to visit my sister in Florida once I recovered, they exchanged glances and quickly changed the subject to more immediate concerns like my medication schedule and upcoming doctor appointments. The most telling moment came when I casually mentioned that I was thinking about changing my will to leave more money to charity, particularly the scholarship fund Robert and I had established at the local high school. The silence that followed was deafening. Diana actually dropped the water glass she was holding, and Marcus began questioning why I would want to make such changes when my children clearly needed the financial support more than some abstract, charitable cause. Over the next few days, I noticed that they'd become more aggressive about managing my affairs. Diana had convinced me to sign several documents that she claimed were updates to my medical directives, but I began to suspect they involved financial matters as well. Marcus had moved most of my important papers to the study, claiming he was organizing them for easier access, but making it impossible for me to review them independently. Timothy had taken over answering all my phone calls, screening visitors, and managing my correspondence. They were isolating me systematically, creating a controlled environment where they could manage information flow and prevent me from making any decisions that might interfere with their inheritance plans. I realized that I was essentially a prisoner in my own home, surrounded by people who were counting the days until my death would set them free to claim their rewards. The turning point came during a visit to Dr. Harrison's office for what I thought was a routine follow-up appointment. Diana had accompanied me, as she had for all my recent medical visits, and she sat in on the consultation as my designated healthcare advocate. Dr. Harrison seemed nervous and uncomfortable as he reviewed my latest test results, glancing frequently at Diana before speaking. "The treatment doesn't seem to be having the effect we hoped for," he said carefully, avoiding direct eye contact with me. "The tumor markers in your blood work suggest that the cancer is progressing faster than we anticipated." I studied his face as he spoke, noting the way his eyes darted toward Diana, almost as if he were seeking approval for his words. Something about his demeanor struck me as wrong, rehearsed perhaps, or at least influenced by conversations I hadn't been part of. "What does that mean in terms of timeline?" Diana asked, leaning forward with what appeared to be concern, but struck me now as eagerness. "It's difficult to predict exactly," Dr. Harrison replied, "but I would estimate perhaps 3 to 4 weeks, maybe less. At this point, I think we should focus entirely on comfort care and pain management rather than continuing aggressive treatment." Diana nodded solemnly and reached over to squeeze my hand. "Whatever keeps Mom most comfortable," she said. "We just want her to be at peace." But I wasn't at peace. Something about the entire interaction felt orchestrated, as if Diana and Dr. Harrison had already discussed these recommendations before I arrived. When I asked to see my actual test results, Dr. Harrison claimed they were too technical for a layperson to understand and promised to mail me a simplified summary. When I requested copies of my complete medical file, he said there were administrative procedures that would take several days to process. As we drove home from the appointment, Diana chatted cheerfully about planning some special family meals for my remaining time, perhaps inviting my sister and a few close friends for a final visit. Her tone was upbeat and practical, as if we were discussing party planning rather than my approaching death. She mentioned that she'd already started reaching out to people to let them know about my prognosis so they could prepare for the inevitable. That evening, I made a decision that would change everything. While my children thought I was sleeping, I carefully made my way to the guest room where Diana had been staying. She was downstairs watching television with her brothers, giving me the opportunity to search through her belongings. In her laptop bag, I found a folder containing copies of documents I'd never seen before. The first was an updated will, apparently signed by me just 2 weeks earlier, though I had no memory of signing any such document. This will divided my entire estate equally among my 3 children, with no provisions for charity or anyone else. The signature looked authentic, but I knew I'd never consciously signed such a document. I could only assume they'd had me sign it during one of my more medicated periods when my judgment was impaired. The second document was a detailed financial analysis of my assets, including bank accounts, retirement funds, life insurance policies, and property values. The calculations were precise and thorough, showing not just my current net worth, but projections of how various investment strategies could maximize the inheritance. There were notes in the margins about tax implications and strategies for minimizing estate taxes. The third and most damning document was a series of email exchanges between Diana and a funeral home director. The correspondence dated back over a month, long before my diagnosis had been confirmed as terminal. They'd been planning my funeral services while I was still undergoing treatment and hoping for recovery. The emails discussed everything from casket selections to catering options for the reception, with Diana providing detailed specifications about what kind of service would best honor my memory while staying within a reasonable budget. But the most shocking discovery was a printed email exchange between Diana and someone whose address I didn't recognize. The conversation revealed that my children had been researching ways to expedite my decline, including withholding certain medications and ensuring that I didn't receive information about experimental treatments that might extend my life. They weren't actively trying to kill me, but they were certainly not interested in helping me live longer than absolutely necessary. The final piece of evidence was a handwritten note in Marcus's distinctive handwriting, apparently notes from a family meeting I hadn't been invited to. The note outlined a timeline for my expected decline and death, with specific dates for when various legal and financial arrangements needed to be completed. There were action items assigned to each sibling, from securing power of attorney documents to researching estate sale companies that could handle disposing of my personal belongings efficiently. I sat on the guest room bed, surrounded by evidence of my children's betrayal, feeling a strange sense of clarity that I hadn't experienced since my diagnosis. The fog of grief, medication, and blind trust finally lifted, revealing the truth about the people I'd devoted my life to raising and supporting. They didn't see me as their mother anymore. I was simply an asset to be liquidated, a problem to be managed until they could claim their inheritance. But as I sat there in the quiet darkness of that room, surrounded by the proof of their deception, I realized something that they had overlooked in all their careful planning. I wasn't dead yet. And more importantly, I wasn't nearly as helpless as they believed me to be. The next morning, I woke up with a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in months. While my children bustled around the house, maintaining their caring facades and discussing my comfort needs, I began to formulate a plan of my own. They thought they were managing a dying woman who was too sick and medicated to understand what was happening around her. They were about to discover just how wrong they were. I started by requesting a private conversation with each of them individually, claiming I wanted to share some personal memories and express my gratitude for their care. With Marcus, I talked about his childhood dreams of becoming a teacher like me, and how proud I was of his business success. With Diana, I reminisced about her artistic talents and her dedication to helping others through her various wellness ventures. With Timothy, I shared stories about his kindness and creativity and how much joy he'd brought to our family. Each conversation served a dual purpose. On the surface, I was playing the role of a dying mother, sharing precious final moments with her children. But underneath, I was testing their reactions and gathering information about their individual motivations and vulnerabilities. I needed to understand not just what they were planning, but why they felt justified in their betrayal. What I discovered was that each of them had constructed elaborate justifications for their actions. Marcus convinced himself that he was protecting the family's financial future by ensuring the inheritance was managed properly. Diana believed she was honoring my memory by planning a beautiful funeral service and handling the practical details I was too sick to manage. Timothy rationalized his participation by focusing on the caregiving he was providing, as if his current devotions somehow earned him the right to profit from my death. None of them seemed to grasp the fundamental immorality of what they were doing. They'd convinced themselves that they were acting out of love and responsibility, rather than greed and self-interest. This psychological disconnect was perhaps more disturbing than the financial betrayal itself. It meant that somewhere, in their development, they'd lost the ability to distinguish between genuine care and self-serving manipulation. But their self-deception would also be their weakness. Because they believed their own justifications, they'd become careless about hiding their true motivations. They assumed I was too sick and trusting to question their actions or investigate their claims. They'd underestimated both my mental capacity and my determination to protect what Robert and I had worked our entire lives to build. As I lay in bed that night, listening to my children discuss funeral flower arrangements in the room below, I began to understand that this wasn't just about money or inheritance. This was about the fundamental question of what family means, and whether blood relations automatically entitle people to unconditional love and support, regardless of their actions. My children had been testing the boundaries of that unconditional love for years, taking increasingly larger amounts of money and making increasingly unreasonable demands on my resources. I'd enabled their behavior by always saying yes, always, bailing them out, always prioritizing their immediate needs over my own long-term security. In doing so, I'd taught them that I was a resource to be exploited rather than a person to be respected. My unconditional love had become conditional on my ability to provide financial support, and now that I was dying, they saw no reason to maintain even the pretense of genuine affection. The realization was painful, but also liberating. I'd spent the past 8 years since Robert's death trying to buy my children's love and attention with money, and I'd succeeded only in teaching them to see me as a bank account with emotional attachments. But now that the end was supposedly near, they'd dropped even the pretense of caring about anything other than their inheritance. I fell asleep that night with a plan beginning to form in my mind. They thought they were managing a helpless dying woman, but they were about to discover that reports of my demise had been greatly exaggerated. More importantly, they were about to learn that a mother's love, once betrayed, can transform into something far more dangerous than they could possibly imagine. My children had made the fatal mistake of underestimating their opponent. They saw an elderly, sick woman who was too trusting and too medicated to protect herself. What they failed to recognize was that I was still Eleanor Mitchell, the woman, who'd spent nearly 4 decades teaching teenagers to think critically and see through deception. I'd dealt with manipulative students, demanding parents, and bureaucratic administrators throughout my career. Handling 3 greedy adult children would simply be the final lesson plan of my teaching career. The education of Marcus, Diana, and Timothy Mitchell was about to begin, and this time, the stakes would be much higher than a failing grade. The morning after discovering my children's betrayal, I woke with the kind of clarity that comes only after surviving something that should have destroyed you. My hands weren't shaking from medication anymore. They were steady with purpose. While Diana puttered around in the kitchen below, preparing what she believed might be one of my last breakfasts, I was upstairs planning my resurrection. The first call I made was to my sister Patricia in Tampa. Patricia had always been the pragmatic one in our family, the sister who questioned everything and trusted no one until they proved themselves worthy. She'd warned me years ago about giving my children too much financial support, but I'd dismissed her concerns as cynicism. Now I needed her sharp mind and her distance from the situation. "Ellie?" Patricia's voice crackled through the old landline. In my bedroom, The phone Robert had insisted on keeping despite my children's suggestions to rely solely on cell phones. You sound different, stronger somehow. I need your help, Pat, and I need you to listen carefully without asking questions until I'm finished. I kept my voice low, acutely aware that Diana was directly below me, and Timothy was somewhere in the house. Over the next 20 minutes, I laid out everything I'd discovered. Patricia listened in silence, occasionally making small sounds of disgust or disbelief. When I finished, the silence stretched so long I thought we'd been disconnected. Finally, Patricia spoke, her voice tight with controlled fury. Those ungrateful parasites. Robert would roll over in his grave if he knew what they were planning. I need you to do something for me, I continued. I need you to call Dr. Harrison's office and request my complete medical records. Tell them you're my sister and that I'm planning to seek a second opinion at a cancer center in Florida. Can you do that? Already writing down the number, Patricia replied. What else? I need you to research Dr. Samuel Chen at Cleveland Clinic. He's supposedly one of the best pancreatic cancer specialists in the region. I want to know if there are any treatment options that Dr. Harrison hasn't mentioned. Done. What about a lawyer? You're going to need legal help to sort this mess out. I'd already thought about that. Remember Robert's college roommate, David Sterling? He's a partner at that big firm in Columbus now. I think it's time I reached out to him. After ending the call with Patricia, I sat quietly for several minutes, listening to the sounds of my children going about their morning routines below. Diana was humming as she prepared breakfast, probably calculating how many more meals she'd have to cook before she could stop pretending to care. Marcus would arrive soon for his weekend visit, bringing his fake concern and his real estate appraisers, I for evaluating my home's contents. Timothy would emerge from his makeshift bedroom on the couch, ready to play the devoted son while secretly counting down the days until his inheritance freed him from his minimum wage responsibilities. They thought they had me trapped in a web of their own design, isolated and dependent on their version of reality. What they didn't understand was that I'd spent nearly 4 decades teaching high school students, many of whom were far more sophisticated, manipulators than they'd ever imagined being. I'd learned to spot lies, identify manipulation tactics, and most importantly, how to gather evidence without alerting the perpetrators to what I was doing. My second call was to David Sterling's office. His secretary tried to brush me off initially, claiming that Mr. Sterling only handled corporate law now and rarely took on estate planning cases. But when I mentioned Robert's name and explained that this involved potential fraud and elder abuse, she put me through immediately. Eleanor Mitchell, David's voice boomed through the phone, warm with genuine affection. I heard about your diagnosis through the college alumni newsletter. How are you holding up? Better than my children hope, I replied, and something in my tone must have alerted him because his voice immediately became more focused and professional. What's going on, Eleanor? I gave him the condensed version of my situation, focusing on the forged will, the unauthorized financial planning, and the evidence I'd found of their inheritance scheming. David listened without interruption, and I could hear him taking notes. This is serious, he said when I finished. What you're describing constitutes elder abuse, fraud, and possibly criminal conspiracy. But before we do anything dramatic, we need to verify a few things. Can you get me copies of the documents you found? I took pictures with the old digital camera Robert used for his birdwatching. The files are on his computer in the study. Good thinking. I'm going to send an investigator to your area, someone who specializes in financial fraud cases. Can you meet with him without your children knowing? I thought for a moment. Tuesday mornings, Diana takes me to the grocery store and then stops at her yoga class. She usually drops me off at the library for an hour while she's in class. I could meet him there. Perfect. His name is Frank Rodriguez, and he'll pose as a library volunteer helping seniors with computer research. Bring those photos if you can manage it. The next challenge was accessing Robert's computer without alerting my children. The study had become Marcus's command center for managing my affairs, but he only used it during his weekend visits. During the week, the room remained largely empty except for Timothy's occasional phone calls, which he made from there to avoid disturbing my supposed rest. That afternoon, while Diana was at the grocery store and Timothy was napping, I made my way to the study. The computer was an older model that Robert had used primarily for email and basic internet research, but it still had the digital camera software installed. I inserted the memory card from the camera and waited for the photos to upload. Looking at the images on the larger screen, the evidence of my children's betrayal was even more damning than I'd remembered. The forged will was particularly obvious when viewed closely. The signature was too perfect, lacking the slight tremor that had affected my handwriting since starting chemotherapy. More telling, the date on the document was from a day when I'd been heavily sedated after a particularly brutal treatment session. I printed copies of the most important documents and hid them in a manila envelope inside an old cookbook in the kitchen, one of the many volumes that my children had ignored during their searches through my belongings. Then I deleted the photos from the computer and cleared the browser history, leaving no trace of my activities. Over the weekend, I observed my children with the detached interest of a scientist studying specimens. Marcus arrived Saturday morning with his typical efficiency, immediately heading to the study to review what he called Mom's paperwork, but which I now understood was his inheritance inventory. He spent hours in there, occasionally emerging to ask Diana about specific assets or to verify information with Timothy. Sandra, Marcus's wife, came with him but seemed uncomfortable with the whole situation. She spent most of her time in the kitchen or the living room, avoiding the study entirely, and limiting her interactions with me to polite small talk about the weather or her son Kevin's college plans. I began to suspect that Sandra either didn't know about the inheritance scheming or disapproved of it but felt powerless to intervene. Diana maintained her caring facade throughout the weekend, bringing me meals I had no appetite for and constantly checking on my comfort level. But I noticed that she spent considerable time on her phone, often stepping outside for private conversations. When I asked who she was talking to, she claimed they were business calls related to closing out her current real estate listings before taking extended time off to care for me. Timothy seemed the most conflicted of the three. Several times I caught him watching me with what looked like genuine sadness, and once I thought I saw tears in his eyes when he thought I wasn't looking. But then he would participate in the hushed family conferences that excluded me, and I would remember that whatever guilt he might feel wasn't enough to stop him from participating in their plan. The most revealing moment came Sunday evening, after Marcus and Sandra had returned to Columbus. Diana was upstairs packing for an overnight trip to visit a client, leaving Timothy and me alone in the living room. He was reading to me from a mystery novel, but his heart clearly wasn't in it. Finally, he closed the book and set it aside. "Mom," he said quietly, "are you scared?" The question caught me off guard. For a moment, I almost answered honestly, almost told him that yes, I was terrified, but not of dying. I was terrified of what my children had become. Terrified that I'd failed so completely as a mother that they could plan my funeral while I was still alive. Instead, I played the role they expected me to play. "A little," I admitted. "But having you kids here makes it easier. Knowing that you'll take care of everything after I'm gone gives me peace." Something flickered across his face, guilt or shame, but then he nodded and picked up the book again. "We love you, Mom. Whatever happens, remember that we love you." The words might have comforted me if I hadn't known they were hollow. Timothy might feel some genuine affection for me, but not enough to override his need for my money. Love, I was learning, was a word my children used when they wanted something from me. Monday brought new developments. Patricia called back with disturbing news about my medical records. Dr. Harrison's office had been reluctant to release the complete files, claiming that some test results were still pending and that it would be better to wait until all information was available. When Patricia pressed them, they finally admitted that my case was complex and suggested that any second opinion consultations should be coordinated through Dr. Harrison's office to ensure continuity of care. "That's not normal, Ellie," Patricia told me. "Medical records belong to the patient, not the doctor. They should have released them immediately when I presented proper authorization." More troubling was Patricia's research into Dr. Samuel Chen at Cleveland Clinic. According to her investigation, Dr. Chen was indeed a respected oncologist, but he specialized in liver cancer, not pancreatic cancer. When Patricia called his office to inquire about treatment options for pancreatic cancer patients, they referred her to a different specialist entirely. "Either Dr. Harrison doesn't know his specialty areas, or he's deliberately giving you misleading information about your options," Patricia concluded. The implications were staggering. If Dr. Harrison was actively limiting my access to appropriate treatment options, it suggested a level of coordination with my children that went beyond simple medical updates. They weren't just planning my funeral. They might be actively influencing my medical care to ensure their timeline remained on track. Tuesday morning arrived with unseasonable warmth for November. Diana was unusually cheerful as she prepared for our weekly grocery store trip, chatting about planning a special Thanksgiving dinner that would include all my favorite foods. The irony wasn't lost on me that she was planning our last family holiday while simultaneously planning my funeral. At the library, I told Diana I wanted to research some family genealogy information for a project I was working on. She seemed pleased by this evidence of my engagement with life and promised to pick me up in exactly 1 hour. As soon as her car disappeared around the corner, I made my way to the computer section where Frank Rodriguez was waiting. Frank looked exactly like what he claimed to be, a middle-aged man in casual clothes who could easily pass for a retired volunteer helping seniors navigate technology. He greeted me warmly and guided me to a computer station in a corner where our conversation wouldn't be overheard. "Mrs. Mitchell, I've reviewed the preliminary information that Mr. Sterling provided. What you're dealing with is more serious than simple inheritance disputes. The forged will alone constitutes multiple felonies, and if we can prove that your medical care has been compromised, we're looking at potential charges of conspiracy and elder abuse." I handed him the manila envelope containing the printed documents. Frank reviewed them quickly, his expression growing more serious with each page. "This is solid evidence," he said finally. "But we need more. I need you to document everything going forward. Keep a journal of conversations, medical appointments, any financial transactions they try to have you sign. Can you do that safely?" "I think so. They're not monitoring me as closely as they think they are." Frank handed me a small device that looked like a hearing aid. "This is a digital recorder. It's voice-activated and has a 12-hour battery life. Wear it during family meetings or medical appointments. Just remember, Ohio is a one-party consent state, so recordings you make are admissible in court." He also gave me a secure phone number where I could reach him 24 hours a day and a small camera disguised as a pen for photographing additional documents. "Don't take any unnecessary risks," he warned. "If they suspect you're investigating them, they might escalate their timeline." The rest of our meeting focused on strategy. Frank would begin conducting background investigations on my children, looking for evidence of their financial problems and any previous fraudulent activities. He would also research Dr. Harrison's practice and any connections he might have to my family. Meanwhile, I would continue documenting their activities while maintaining my facade of a dying, helpless mother. When Diana picked me up from the library, she seemed pleased that I appeared more energetic than I had in weeks. I told her that researching our family history had given me a sense of connection to something larger than my illness, and that I was feeling more hopeful about the time I had left. "That's wonderful, Mom," she said, squeezing my hand. "Maintaining a positive attitude is so important for your recovery." The word recovery hung in the air between us. I wondered if she even realized she'd said it, or if some part of her Subconscious still hoped that I might survive long enough to make their deception unnecessary. But then she began talking about the special Thanksgiving meal she was planning, describing it in terms that made it clear she expected it to be my last holiday meal, and I knew that any hope for genuine remorse was wishful thinking. That evening, I began keeping the journal that Frank had requested. Writing by hand was difficult due to the tremor in my fingers, but I persevered, documenting every conversation, every suspicious behavior, every piece of evidence that supported my case. The physical act of writing helped me process the emotional trauma of my situation, while creating a legal record that could protect me if this situation escalated further. The next few days passed in a strange rhythm of normalcy, punctuated by moments of crystal-clear awareness of my children's deception. Diana continued her attentive caregiving, bringing me meals and medications on schedule, reading to me in the evenings, and maintaining cheerful conversation about topics she thought would interest me. But I noticed that she was becoming more insistent about me taking my pain medications, even when I told her I was feeling relatively comfortable. Marcus called every evening with his updates about my care, always asking detailed questions about my energy levels, appetite, and overall condition. The questions felt more like a medical chart review than genuine concern, and I began to suspect that he was tracking my decline for reasons that had nothing to do with ensuring my comfort. Timothy remained the most conflicted member of the trio. He would sit with me for hours, sometimes just holding my hand or playing quiet music, and during those moments I caught glimpses of the sweet child he'd once been. But then he would disappear for private phone conversations or huddle with his siblings in urgent whispered conferences, and I would remember that he was as committed to this betrayal as the others. The breakthrough came on Thursday evening. I'd been feeling unusually drowsy all day, despite sleeping well the night before, and I'd noticed that my thinking seemed cloudier than usual. Diana had been particularly attentive, checking on me frequently and encouraging me to take additional doses of my pain medication to help me sleep better. As I prepared for bed, I made a decision to skip my evening medications and see if my symptoms improved. I told Diana that I was feeling better and didn't think I needed the pain medication that night, but she insisted that maintaining a consistent schedule was important for managing my condition. The doctor said it's better to stay ahead of the pain rather than trying to catch up to it, she explained, holding out the pills and a glass of water. Just take them to be safe. I pretended to swallow the medications but actually palmed them, disposing of them later in a tissue. The next morning, I woke feeling more alert and energetic than I had in days. The fog that had been clouding my thinking had lifted, and I was able to concentrate more clearly on my surroundings and conversations. The implications were terrifying. If Diana was giving me medications beyond what Dr. Harrison had prescribed, or if she was administering drugs that weren't actually prescribed for my condition, she wasn't just planning my funeral. She was actively hastening my decline to ensure their inheritance timeline remained on track. I began checking the medication bottles more carefully, comparing the pills to online descriptions of their appearance and effects. Several of the medications Diana had been giving me didn't match the prescriptions, and one bottle contained pills that weren't identified anywhere in my medical records. When I researched the unmarked pills online, I discovered they were powerful sedatives that could cause cognitive impairment and physical weakness when used long-term. The evidence was mounting that my children weren't just waiting for me to die naturally. They were actively contributing to my decline through medication manipulation, probably hoping to make my death appear like a natural progression of my disease. The realization that my own daughter was slowly poisoning me was almost more than I could process, but it also gave me the final piece of evidence I needed to take action against them. Frank had told me that proof of active harm would strengthen any criminal case exponentially, and medication tampering was a serious felony that could result in significant prison time. I began documenting everything more carefully, photographing the medication bottles and pills, recording conversations where Diana insisted I take extra medications, and noting the correlation between my medication compliance and my cognitive clarity. I also started pretending to take the medications while actually disposing of them, which led to a remarkable improvement in my energy and mental acuity. The irony wasn't lost on me that my children's attempts to hasten my death were actually helping me gather the evidence I needed to destroy them. Their overconfidence in their ability to manipulate me had made them careless, and their carelessness was about to become their downfall. By the end of the week, I had enough evidence to proceed with Frank's investigation and to contact law enforcement, if necessary. But I also had a different plan beginning to form in my mind. My children thought they were managing a helpless victim who would die on their schedule and leave them wealthy beyond their dreams. They were about to discover that their victim was very much alive, very much aware of their schemes, and very much prepared to fight back with every tool at her disposal. The student had become the teacher, and class was about to begin. Saturday. Brought Marcus and Sandra for their regular weekend visit, but this time I was ready for them. I'd hidden the recording device Frank had given me in my cardigan pocket, and I was prepared to document whatever inheritance discussions they thought. I was too sick to overhear. The family meeting began after dinner, when they thought I was napping upstairs, but I was actually positioned at the top of the staircase, listening to every word while the recorder captured their conversation for posterity. The timeline is moving faster than we expected, Marcus was saying. Dr. Harrison thinks maybe 2 weeks now, possibly less. That's actually better for us, Diana replied. I was worried about maintaining this level of caregiving much longer. It's emotionally exhausting to pretend everything is normal when we know what's coming. The funeral arrangements are finalized, Timothy added. I picked up the program proofs yesterday. They look really nice, very dignified. What about the house? Sandra asked, speaking for the first time. Have you decided whether to renovate before selling? The real estate agent thinks we should do minimal improvements, Diana explained. Fresh paint, some minor repairs, maybe update the master bathroom. Nothing major that would delay the sale. Marcus rustled some papers. I've been working with the financial advisor about the investment strategy for the inheritance. If we're smart about this, we can each clear about $200,000 after taxes and expenses. More than enough to solve all our problems, Timothy said with obvious relief. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, covering everything from tax implications to the logistics of clearing out my personal belongings. They discussed my jewelry, my furniture, even my books and photo albums as if they were items in an estate sale catalog, rather than treasured possessions with decades of memories attached. But the most damaging part of the conversation was Marcus's casual mention of their medication strategy. Diana's been doing a great job managing Mom's pain levels, he said, keeping her comfortable and making sure she's not suffering unnecessarily. The sedatives have been particularly helpful, Diana agreed. They keep her calm and prevent any anxiety about her condition. I think she's much more peaceful now than she was a month ago. Sandra's voice was troubled when she spoke. Are you sure it's appropriate to be making those kinds of medical decisions without her doctor's knowledge? Dr. Harrison knows what we're doing, Marcus replied smoothly. He agreed that keeping her comfortable was the priority, and he's given us discretion to adjust her medications as needed. The lie was delivered so smoothly that I almost believed it myself, but I knew that Dr. Harrison had never authorized Diana to administer additional medications, and the sedatives she'd been giving me weren't part of my prescribed treatment plan. By the time the family meeting ended, I had more than enough evidence to proceed with criminal charges against all 3 of my children. The recording captured their admissions of inheritance planning, their discussions of medication manipulation, and their complete lack of genuine concern for my well-being. But I still wasn't ready to play my hand. I wanted to see how far they would go, how brazen they would become when they thought victory was within their grasp. More importantly, I wanted to ensure that when I finally revealed the truth, the consequences would be swift, severe, and permanent. The next phase of my plan required patience and careful timing. My children had spent months maneuvering me into position for their final betrayal. Now it was my turn to maneuver them into position for their destruction. They'd taught me that family loyalty was conditional and that love could be bought and sold like any other commodity. It was time for them to learn what happened when the transaction was reversed and the price came due in full. Monday morning arrived with the crisp promise of December, and I woke feeling more alive than I had in months. The sedatives Diana had been secretly administering were completely out of my system now, and my mind was sharp with purpose. Today would be the beginning of the end for my children's elaborate deception. Frank Rodriguez called at precisely 9 o'clock, using the secure number he'd given me. His investigation had uncovered information that exceeded even my worst suspicions about my children's activities. "Mrs. Mitchell, we need to meet today. I've discovered some things that change everything about your situation." His voice carried an urgency that made my pulse quicken. "Diana's taking me to my oncology appointment this afternoon. Could you be there?" "Actually, that's part of what I need to discuss with you. I've been investigating Dr. Harrison, and there are some serious irregularities in his practice that directly relate to your case." We arranged to meet at the medical center parking garage 30 minutes before my scheduled appointment. Diana was pleased when I told her I was feeling well enough to walk around the medical complex before my appointment, suggesting that some fresh air might do me good before we went inside. Frank was waiting beside a blue sedan when we arrived. He approached, as Diana was helping me out of her car, introducing himself as a medical advocate who worked with cancer patients to ensure they received appropriate care. Mrs. Mitchell mentioned that she was interested in exploring additional treatment options, he told Diana smoothly. "I'd like to review her medical records to see if there might be any protocols she hasn't been offered." Diana's expression tightened almost imperceptibly, but she maintained her caring facade. "Of course, we want Mom to have every possible option. Dr. Harrison has been wonderful, though, very thorough and compassionate." "I'm sure he has," Frank replied. "Would it be possible for me to sit in on today's appointment? Sometimes a fresh perspective can be helpful." I could see Diana calculating rapidly, trying to find a reason to refuse without appearing obstructive. Finally, she nodded reluctantly. "If Mom is comfortable with it, I suppose that would be fine." As we walked toward the medical building, Frank quietly filled me in on what his investigation had revealed. Dr. Harrison was facing serious financial difficulties related to some bad investments and mounting malpractice insurance costs. More troubling, he'd been receiving regular payments from Marcus over the past 2 months, ostensibly for consulting services related to my care. "Your son has been paying your doctor to manage your treatment in ways that align with their inheritance timeline," Frank explained quietly. "It's not just medical fraud, it's conspiracy to commit elder abuse." The appointment itself was revealing in ways I hadn't anticipated. Dr. Harrison seemed nervous when Frank introduced himself as my medical advocate, and his examination was more cursory than usual. When Frank began asking detailed questions about my treatment options and prognosis, Dr. Harrison became visibly uncomfortable. "The cancer is quite advanced," Dr. Harrison explained, avoiding eye contact with me. "At this stage, aggressive treatment would likely cause more suffering than benefit. Comfort care is really the most humane approach." Frank had clearly done his homework. "Have you considered any of the new immunotherapy protocols? I understand there have been some promising results with pancreatic cancer patients who have similar presentations." "Those treatments are experimental and not appropriate for someone in Mrs. Mitchell's condition," Dr. Harrison replied quickly. "The side effects would be too severe for someone her age." "What about the clinical trial at Johns Hopkins that's specifically designed for patients over 60? I believe the enrollment criteria match Mrs. Mitchell's case profile almost exactly." The silence that followed was deafening. Dr. Harrison glanced at Diana, then back at Frank, clearly struggling to maintain his professional composure. "I'm not familiar with that particular study," he said finally. Frank smiled coldly. "That's interesting. Since the principal investigator sent information about the trial to your office 6 weeks ago, specifically requesting that you consider referring appropriate patients, I watched this exchange with growing clarity about the depth of the conspiracy against me. Dr. Harrison hadn't just been withholding treatment options. He'd been actively hiding opportunities that might extend my life or even lead to recovery. My children had essentially bribed my doctor to ensure I died on their preferred schedule. After the appointment, Diana was quiet during the drive home. I could sense her mind working, trying to assess how much damage Frank's questions might have caused to their carefully constructed narrative. When we arrived at the house, she immediately disappeared into the study for a long phone conversation, presumably with Marcus. That evening, I overheard a family conference call that confirmed my worst fears about how far they were prepared to go. Timothy had arrived for what they claimed was an impromptu visit, but I now understood was actually a crisis management meeting. The medical advocate is a problem, Marcus was saying through the speakerphone. If he starts digging into Mom's treatment history, he might uncover the consulting arrangement. Maybe we should consider accelerating the timeline, Diana suggested. If Mom's condition deteriorated more rapidly, it would seem natural. People would expect her to decline quickly at this stage. What are you suggesting? Timothy asked, and I could hear the concern in his voice. Just that we might need to be more aggressive about managing her comfort level, Diana replied carefully. Higher doses of pain medication, additional sedatives to help with anxiety. It would be merciful, really. The conversation continued for another 15 minutes. But I'd heard enough. They weren't just planning to let me die naturally anymore. They were discussing actively hastening my death to prevent their scheme from being discovered. The desperate edge in their voices told me that Frank's investigation had them genuinely worried. I made my decision that night. It was time to end this charade before they escalated from fraud and elder abuse to something that would be impossible to come back from. I called Frank using the secure phone he'd given me. They're planning to increase my medication dosages, I told him. I think they're getting ready to move from passive to active measures. How quickly can you get out of that house safely? Frank asked. I've been thinking about that. Tomorrow is Thanksgiving. They're planning a big family dinner that they expect to be my last holiday meal. It would be the perfect time to spring our trap. Frank was quiet for a moment. That's risky. If they suspect you're onto them, they might panic and do something irreversible. They're already discussing that option. At least this way, we control the timing and the circumstances. We spent the next hour coordinating our plan. Frank would contact David Sterling and arrange for law enforcement to be standing by. Patricia would drive up from Florida, ostensibly for a surprise Thanksgiving visit, but actually to serve as a witness and to ensure my safety. I would continue playing the role of a dying woman while secretly documenting their final preparations for my demise. Thanksgiving morning dawned gray and cold, but the house was filled with the warm smells of Diana's cooking. She'd thrown herself into preparing an elaborate feast, complete with all my supposed favorite dishes. The irony of preparing a last meal for someone you're planning to murder wasn't lost on me. Marcus and Sandra arrived with Kevin, their 17-year-old son, who seemed uncomfortable with the forced cheerfulness of the occasion. I realized that Kevin probably sensed something wrong with the family dynamics, but was too young to understand the full scope of what his father and aunts were planning. The most surreal part of the morning was opening Thanksgiving gifts. Each of my children had prepared what they claimed were early Christmas presents, but which I now understood were actually farewell gifts designed to create touching memories for my funeral service. Diana gave me a photo album containing pictures from our family vacations when the children were young. Marcus presented me with a framed copy of my teaching certificate and a collection of thank you letters from former students. Timothy's gift was a recording he'd made of himself reading some of my favorite poems. Under different circumstances, These gifts would have been deeply meaningful expressions of love and gratitude. Knowing what I now knew about their true motivations, they felt like elaborate props in a performance designed to ease their own guilt about what they were planning to do. At 2:00, as we were sitting down to dinner, Patricia arrived unannounced. The shock on my children's faces was immediate and poorly concealed. They'd been expecting a quiet family meal where they could control the narrative and manage my condition without outside interference. "Aunt Patricia!" Timothy exclaimed, recovering first and embracing her with what looked like genuine affection. What a wonderful surprise. "I couldn't let Ellie spend what might be her last Thanksgiving without her big sister," Patricia replied, and I caught the meaningful look she gave me. "I hope you don't mind me crashing your family dinner." Diana recovered her composure quickly. "Of course not. We're always happy to see you. I'll set another place." Throughout dinner, Patricia asked pointed questions about my medical care, my treatment options, and my overall prognosis. She played the role of a concerned sister beautifully, expressing surprise at how advanced my condition had become and questioning whether I'd explored all available options. "Have you considered seeking a second opinion?" she asked Marcus directly. "Some of the cancer centers in Florida have protocols that might not be available here in Ohio." "Mom's very comfortable with Dr. Harrison," Marcus replied carefully. "We don't want to put her through the stress of traveling or starting over with new doctors at this stage." "Of course," Patricia agreed. "But surely gathering information couldn't hurt. Knowledge is power, especially when dealing with something this serious." I watched my children exchange glances across the dinner table, clearly communicating their concern about Patricia's line of questioning. They'd become so accustomed to controlling my information and my environment that having an outsider ask logical questions about my care was threatening their entire narrative. After dinner, as Diana was serving dessert, I made my announcement. "I have something important to tell all of you," I said, my voice stronger than it had been in months. "I've made some decisions about my medical care and my estate that I want to share." The silence that fell over the table was profound. Each of my children leaned forward slightly, their attention focused entirely on what I was about to say. "I've decided to seek a second opinion about my condition," I continued. "Patricia has arranged for me to be evaluated at a cancer center in Tampa next week." "Mom, that's wonderful," Diana said, but her smile looked forced. "Though I'm not sure you're strong enough for that kind of travel right now. Actually, I've been feeling much stronger lately. Almost like my old self again." I looked directly at Diana as I said this, watching her face carefully. It's amazing how much better I feel when I'm not taking so many medications. Something flickered in Diana's eyes, a flash of understanding that I might not be as compliant or as oblivious as she'd assumed. "I've also been reviewing my estate planning," I continued. "I want to make sure everything is properly organized and that my wishes are clearly documented." Marcus cleared his throat. "We've already taken care of most of that, Mom. Remember? We updated your will a few weeks ago to make sure everything was current." "Actually, I don't remember signing any new will," I replied calmly. "My memory has been a bit foggy lately, but I'm quite certain I would remember something that important. I'd like to review any documents you think I've signed." The tension at the table was now palpable. Timothy was staring at his dessert plate, avoiding eye contact with anyone. Sandra looked confused and uncomfortable, clearly sensing undercurrents she didn't understand. Kevin had stopped eating entirely and was watching the adults with the sharp attention of a teenager who realizes something significant is happening. "Perhaps we should discuss this privately," Marcus suggested. "We don't want to bore Patricia and Kevin with legal details." "Actually," Patricia interjected, "as Eleanor's sister and closest living relative besides her children, I think I should be involved in any discussions about her estate planning, especially if there have been recent changes to important documents." I could see my children beginning to panic. Their carefully controlled environment was being disrupted by questions they weren't prepared to answer and witnesses they couldn't manage or manipulate. That's when Diana made her fatal mistake. "Mom's been under a lot of stress and medication lately," she said to Patricia. "Sometimes her memory isn't as clear as it used to be. We're just trying to make sure her affairs are handled properly while she's still able to participate in the decisions." "That's interesting," I replied, my voice perfectly calm. "Because I've been feeling much more clear-headed lately. Clear enough to remember conversations and events that I'm quite certain actually happened." The silence stretched for several seconds before Marcus attempted to regain control of the situation. "Maybe we should continue this conversation later, after Mom has had a chance to rest." "Actually, I think now is the perfect time," I said, reaching into my cardigan pocket and pulling out the small recorder Frank had given me. "Especially since I have some questions about conversations I've overheard recently." The effect was immediate and devastating. Diana went completely pale. Marcus pushed back from the table as if the recorder were a weapon pointed at him. Timothy finally looked up from his plate, his eyes wide with dawning horror. "You see," I continued conversationally, "when you're supposedly dying, people tend to have very interesting conversations around you. They assume you're too sick or too medicated to understand what they're saying, but it turns out I understand quite a lot." I pressed play on the recorder, and Marcus's voice filled the dining room. "The timeline is moving faster than we expected. Dr. Harrison thinks maybe 2 weeks now, possibly less." Diana's voice followed. "That's actually better for us. I was worried about maintaining this level of caregiving much longer." I let the recording play for 30 seconds before stopping. The silence that followed was broken only by Sandra's sharp intake of breath and Kevin's whispered, "What the hell?" "I have hours of recordings," I said quietly. "Conversations about funeral arrangements made while I was still alive. Discussions about selling my house and dividing my assets. Plans for managing my medications to keep me comfortable and ensure I died on your preferred timeline." Patricia was staring at my children with undisguised disgust. Sandra had covered her mouth with her hand, her eyes wide with shock. Kevin was looking at his father as if he'd never seen him before. "Mom, you don't understand," Marcus began. But I held up my hand to stop him. "I understand perfectly," I replied. "I understand that you forged a will in my name. I understand that you've been paying Dr. Harrison to limit my treatment options. I understand that Diana has been giving me sedatives that weren't prescribed to keep me compliant and confused, and I understand that you've been planning my funeral while I pay your bills." The accusations hung in the air like smoke from a fire that was about to consume everything they'd worked for. Diana was crying now, but they were tears of frustration and fear, not remorse. Marcus was calculating, his businessman's mind probably already working on damage control strategies. Timothy looked genuinely stricken, as if he was finally understanding the full magnitude of what they'd done. "The most interesting discovery," I continued, "was learning that I don't actually have terminal cancer." This statement caused a reaction I hadn't expected. Marcus literally fell back in his chair, and Diana's crying stopped abruptly as if someone had flipped a switch. "That's impossible," Diana whispered. Dr. Harrison said what you paid him to say," I interrupted. "But when I had my medical records independently reviewed, the truth came out. I have a benign tumor that's easily treatable with surgery. The original biopsy results were misread, probably deliberately to support the terminal diagnosis you needed for your inheritance scheme." The silence that followed was different from the previous pauses in our conversation. This was the silence of people whose entire world had just collapsed around them. They'd spent months planning for my death, dividing my assets, and preparing for their inheritance windfall. And now they were learning that not only was I not dying, but I knew exactly what they'd been planning. Patricia reached over and squeezed my hand. "How long have you known?" she asked quietly. "About the cancer misdiagnosis?" "Just this week." "About their inheritance scheme?" I've been investigating for almost a month. I looked around the table at my children's faces, seeing them clearly for perhaps the first time in years. You want to know the saddest part? If you'd simply asked me for help with your financial problems, I probably would have given you the money willingly. I've been supporting all of you for years anyway. But instead, you chose to let me believe I was dying while you planned how to profit from my death. Kevin suddenly pushed back from the table and stood up. "This is sick," he said, his young voice cracking with emotion. "Grandma, I swear I didn't know. I thought they were just taking care of you." "I know, sweetheart," I replied gently. "This isn't about you." Sandra stood up as well, her face flushed with anger and embarrassment. "Marcus, we're leaving, now." She turned to me. "Mrs. Mitchell, I am so sorry. I had no idea what they were planning. If I had known—" "I believe you," I said. "And I appreciate that." Marcus remained seated, but his face had taken on the calculating expression I'd seen during his business phone calls. "What do you want?" he asked finally. "I want my house keys back. I want you to remove all of your belongings from my property, and I want all three of you out of my life permanently." "Mom, please," Timothy said, speaking for the first time since the recording played. "We made a terrible mistake, but we're still your children." "No," I replied firmly. "My children died the day you decided to forge my will and plan my funeral while I was still alive. I don't know who you people are, but you're not the children I raised." Diana finally found her voice. "You can't just disown us. We're family." "Family doesn't try to murder each other," Patricia said coldly. "Because that's what you were doing, Diana. Giving someone unauthorized medications to hasten their death is attempted murder." As if summoned by her words, the doorbell rang. Through the window, I could see police cars in my driveway, and Frank Rodriguez walking up the front steps with several uniformed officers. "I called them before dinner," I explained calmly. "I thought you should have the opportunity to explain your actions to law enforcement directly." The next hour passed in a blur of police questions, evidence collection, and arrests. Marcus, Diana, and Timothy were each read their rights and taken into custody on charges of elder abuse, fraud, conspiracy, and attempted murder. The forged will, the medication bottles, and the recorded conversations provided overwhelming evidence of their crimes. Sandra left with Kevin, promising to testify about what she'd witnessed if needed. Patricia stayed with me as we gave our statements to the police and watched my children being loaded into police cars in my driveway. "How do you feel?" Patricia asked me as we watched the police cars disappear down Maple Street. I thought about her question for a long moment. "Free," I said finally. "For the first time in years, I feel completely free." The legal proceedings that followed were swift and decisive. The evidence against my children was overwhelming, and their attorneys advised them to accept plea bargains rather than risk longer sentences at trial. Marcus received 5 years for fraud and conspiracy. Diana got 7 years for the medication tampering charges. Timothy, because of his cooperation with the investigation and his obvious remorse, received 3 years with the possibility of parole in 18 months. Dr. Harrison lost his medical license and received 2 years for his part in the conspiracy. The medical board's investigation revealed that this wasn't his first involvement in questionable end-of-life care decisions, and several other families came forward with similar concerns about his treatment of their elderly relatives. My surgery to remove the benign tumor was scheduled for January, and my prognosis was excellent. The recovery would take several weeks, but there was no reason I couldn't expect many more years of healthy, active life. Patricia moved to Ohio to help during my recovery and decided to stay permanently. We sold her house in Florida and used the proceeds to renovate my home into a comfortable space for both of us. I changed my will to leave my estate to educational charities and medical research foundations, with small bequests to Kevin and any other grandchildren who might come along. My children would inherit nothing from me, but they would have the opportunity to rebuild their lives when they completed their prison sentences. The house on Maple Street became a different place after that Thanksgiving. Patricia and I filled it with laughter, book clubs, garden parties, and visits from friends who appreciated honesty and genuine affection. We traveled together, volunteered at local charities, and built the kind of life I'd always wanted but had been too busy enabling my children to create. People in town often asked me if I missed my children or if I regretted having them prosecuted. The answer was always the same. I missed the children I thought I'd raised, but I didn't miss the strangers who had tried to kill me for my money. Some betrayals cut so deep that forgiveness becomes impossible, and some relationships become so toxic that the only healthy choice is complete severance. I learned that love without respect is meaningless, and that family loyalty must be earned rather than assumed. My children had spent years taking advantage of my unconditional love, gradually escalating their demands until they felt entitled to my death for their financial benefit. By holding them accountable for their actions, I wasn't destroying our family. I was acknowledging that they had destroyed it long before I discovered their betrayal. 6 months after their arrests, I received letters from each of them in prison. Marcus's letter was full of self-justification and attempts to minimize his role in the conspiracy. Diana's letter blamed her actions on financial stress and claimed she'd never intended for me to be seriously harmed. Timothy's letter contained what seemed like genuine remorse and a plea for eventual forgiveness. I didn't respond to any of them. Some bridges, once burned, cannot and should not be rebuilt. Some trust, once broken, cannot be repaired. Some love, once betrayed, cannot be restored. Instead, I focused on building new relationships with people who valued honesty, integrity, and genuine care for others. I reconnected with former students, strengthened friendships that had been neglected during my years of enabling my children, and discovered that life after betrayal could be richer and more meaningful than life before it. The house that had once echoed with the whispered plans of people who wanted me dead now rang with the laughter of people who valued my life. The dining room where my children had planned my funeral now hosted dinner parties where Patricia and I entertained friends who celebrated our continued health and happiness. Every morning, I woke up grateful to be alive and free from the toxic relationships that had nearly destroyed me. Every evening, I went to sleep secure in the knowledge that the people in my life genuinely cared about my well-being rather than my bank account. My children had tried to steal my life for money. Instead, they'd given me the greatest gift imaginable, the knowledge that I was strong enough to survive their betrayal and wise enough to choose freedom over dysfunction. They'd planned my funeral while I paid their bills, but in the end, the only thing that died was my willingness to tolerate their abuse. I was very much alive, and I intended to stay that way for a very long time. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.